Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your source material and turn it into clear, usable knowledge. And today, we are going on a deep dive, a really thorough investigation into one of the biggest challenges in the English language.
Yeah, it's a mystery that confuses pretty much everyone, doesn't it? Even people who've spoken English their whole lives. Why is the spelling so illogical, so inconsistent? We're going to explore the chaos of English orthography, the writing system, and find out how history basically left us with this mess.
And we especially want to give a warm welcome to all our new learners joining us today from the Morozova School. We know you're focused on clear, accessible learning, so we'll make sure to slow the pace just a little bit sometimes and really unpack this complex topic carefully. Our mission today is to reveal the story behind English spelling, including a pretty radical attempt to fix it all by none other than Benjamin Franklin.
Absolutely. And if you want a quick sense of just how big the problem is, you only need to look at a famous poem called The Chaos. It was written about a century ago. And this poem, it uses over 800 examples just to show how English spelling seems to, well, refuse to follow any consistent rules.
It's a brilliant hook, actually. The poem asks you right away to compare words that, they look like they should rhyme, but they just don't. Think about words like corpse, C-O-R-P-S-E, then core, C-O-R-P-S, then horse, and worse. They look similar, but the sounds...
Completely different.
Exactly. The simple fact is, English has this fundamental conflict between sound and letter, and it makes learning the language feel like you're solving a riddle sometimes. So let's dig in and find out how we got here.
Okay, so let's unpack this historical problem. The real root of the chaos is that the written language, the spelling, kind of got stuck in time.
Yeah.
English spelling became more or less fixed before the way people actually spoke the language had finished changing.
Right. And we have to remember English isn't, pure. It's a hybrid language. It started out Germanic, but then it just sort of soaked up words like a sponge, constantly borrowing from invaders, from scholars.
Exactly. Think about the Norman Conquest back in 1066.
Yeah.
For like 300 years after that, the people in charge, the government, the courts, academics, they were speaking Anglo-Norman French.
So that French influence wasn't just a few fancy words here and there. It fundamentally changed things, didn't it? Even how we spell and say basic, everyday terms, words like jury, clerk, even justice, they all came into English from Anglo-Norman French, and they brought their spellings with them.
But the real kicker, the thing that almost guaranteed our spelling would be a confusing mess, was this huge phonetic change called the Great Vowel Shift. It happened over a long period, roughly 1350 to 1700. Late Middle Ages, early Renaissance.
That's a really long time for a change like that. And what's so interesting is that people started saying their long vowels completely differently, but the writing, the spelling, it just stayed the same.
That's exactly right. So take the word name. In Middle English, it sounded more like name, a bit like how we say calm today, N-A-M-E. But the written spelling, N-A-M-E, it didn't change even as the pronunciation shifted completely over generations. So what's the result? We ended up with these old traditional spellings for completely new sounds, which means essentially every English learner today is kind of studying Middle English history just to write a modern word.
Wow. And then just as pronunciation was in total flux, this massive technological shift happens. The printing press arrives in London, William Caxton, 1476.
Yeah, this was the moment spelling really started to solidify, to get locked down. In Caxton, he hired typesetters to run his presses, but these guys were often foreigners. Many were Dutch, actually, and they didn't necessarily speak English perfectly or even well.
So they didn't know all the nuances of pronunciation?
Exactly. So they sometimes introduced spellings based on their own languages. A classic example is the word ghost, G-O-S-T. It gained a silent H to become ghost. Why? Because it matched the Dutch word geest, G-H-E-E-S-T.
Wait a second. So not only was the spelling being fixed by people who didn't fully get the language, but I read somewhere they were sometimes paid by the line. So they actually had an incentive to make words longer.
That's absolutely part of the story, yeah. They might add an extra letter, maybe a silent E at the end of a word, just to fill out the line of text and, earn a bit more cash. And that just helped cement spellings that were even less phonetic, meaning they didn't match the sound, and it added more of these things we now call silent letters.
Okay, so we've got this historical cocktail, right? Borrowing words, sounds shifting underneath, and then printing, locking it all down, sometimes based on mistakes or even financial incentives. Now let's look at the confusing results we're all still dealing with when we read and write English today. English has only 26 letters in its alphabet, but it has over 44 distinct sounds. That mismatch alone causes huge inconsistency.
Right, that inconsistency means we're forced to have lots of different ways to spell just one sound. Think about the letter C. Sometimes it makes the S sound, like in city. Other times it makes the K sound, like in cat. And it gets even wilder with the most common sound in spoken English, that little sound. Linguists call it the schwa. Our research shows there are something like 13 different ways to spell that one simple sound.
13 ways. Wow. And another big source of confusion came later, didn't it? Around the 16th century, scholars started messing with spelling, too. Academics decided to sort of correct English words by adding silent letters, often to make them look more like their supposed Latin or Greek origins, to give English a bit more, I don't know, prestige.
Exactly. And they often did this, even when the historical link they imagined was completely wrong. A famous example is the word debt, D-E-B-T. It originally came into English spelled just debt, D-E-T, no B. But these scholars, they knew the Latin word debitum, and they thought, let's stick a B in there to show that connection, even though the B was never pronounced in English. The visual link was more important than the sound.
That's incredible. And what about island? I remember reading about that one.
Same story. It comes from an Old English word, island, I-L-A-N-D, no S. But later scholars mistakenly thought it must be related to the Latin word insula, which means island. So they just jammed an S in there, creating island. It's completely unhistorical, but it's stuck.
So these silent letters, they actually hide the real history of the spoken word sometimes and just add another layer of difficulty for anyone learning.
And this whole messy history leaves us with categories of tricky words that, all learners just have to memorize. Let's clarify a couple of those terms because they can be confusing. Sometimes you have words that sound exactly the same, but they're spelled differently and mean different things. We often call these homophones, same sound.
Right, like hair, H-A-I-R on your head, and hare, H-A-R-E, the animal, they sound identical. You have absolutely no way of knowing which one someone means if you just hear it. You need the context, or you need to see it written down.
Precisely. And then you have the opposite problem. Words that are spelled exactly the same way, but they have totally different meanings and, crucially, different pronunciations. These are often called homographs. Same writing.
Yeah, these are the ones that can really trip you up when you're reading. Think about B-O-W. Is it pronounced bow, like a ribbon you tie? Or is it bow, like when you bend forward after a performance?
Or T-E-A-R. Is it tear, the water from your eye?
Yeah.
Or tear, like when you rip paper.
You absolutely have to know the context first, just to know how to say the word you're looking at.
So given all this inconsistency, this sheer difficulty in just reading and writing your own language, it's really no surprise that people have been trying to fix English spelling for centuries.
Yeah, and we're not just talking about little tweaks here and there, like simplifying go to though. We're talking about really radical, fundamental changes. And we wanted to focus on one of the earliest and maybe most famous proposals, which came from Benjamin Franklin, way back in 1768.
That's right. Franklin, the famous inventor, scientist, statesman.
Yeah.
He looked at English spelling almost like an engineering problem that needed solving. He believed that if English could be made truly phonetic, where every distinct sound had one unique letter and only one wa, then spelling would become simple. It would be logical and accessible for everyone.
Okay, so what was his actual plan? He looked at the existing Latin alphabet we use and basically decided what was useful and what was just causing confusion. And this is the part I find kind of amazing. He proposed removing 6 standard letters entirely. He thought C, J, Q, W, X, and Y were redundant or confusing. He figured their sounds could just be represented by other letters or combinations. Just ditching 6 letters, that's quite a step.
It was definitely radical, but it was methodical too. He didn't just remove letters. He also realized the standard alphabet didn't have enough characters to represent all the distinct sounds in English clearly, remember, over 44 sounds. So he actually invented several brand new letters himself.
New letters, what sounds were they for?
Well, they were designed to represent common English sounds that always cause spelling trouble using the standard alphabet. Things like the she sound, the eng sound, e, like at the end of singing, and also the sounds we have, the voiced one, a, like in the word this, and the voiceless one, a, like in the word think. His alphabet had unique symbols for all of those.
Okay, that does sound logical. But did it catch on?
Well, no, sadly for Franklin, his phonetic alphabet never really took off. But what's truly fascinating is the legacy. One of those new characters he designed, the one for the eng sound linguists often call it eng. It looks like an N with a tail. It was considered so useful and accurate that it was eventually incorporated into the International Phonetic Alphabet, the IPA. That's the system linguists all over the world still use today to precisely represent speech sounds. So a piece of his idea lives on.
That's really cool. But still, despite how clever his system might have been, and his fame, the alphabet failed. Which brings us right to the core debate. Why is spelling reform so incredibly difficult?
Well, you have strong arguments on both sides. Those who support reform, and they often think about learners, or making English easier as a global language, they argue that a phonetic system would make learning much quicker, much more efficient, maybe even cheaper in terms of education.
That makes sense. Easier to learn, easier to use internationally.
But then you have the critics, and their main argument is often about history, about etymology. They argue that changing the spelling to be purely phonetic would hide a word's origins, its history. They might say if we started spelling the word light phonetically, maybe as L-I-T, we'd lose that visual connection to its historical roots, maybe related words in other Germanic languages.
And there's a practical reading argument too, isn't there, about those homophones we mentioned earlier?
Exactly. Critics point out, quite practically, that we'd lose the really useful visual distinction between words that sound the same but mean different things. If we suddenly started spelling knight, the medieval soldier, and night, the dark time, the same way, because they sound alike, reading could actually become harder, not easier. You'd lose that immediate visual clue. Someone actually wrote to Franklin back in 1768 making this exact point, said essentially, all our etymologies would be lost. We couldn't ascertain the meaning of many words. That visual link to the past and the ability to distinguish words, it just proved too powerful to change.
Right, so let's try to summarize our deep dive today. English spelling is as tricky as it is, largely because of this historical collision. The written language got kind of frozen by the printing press, just as the spoken language was going through massive sound changes, like the Great Vowel Shift.
Yeah, and that initial chaos was then made worse by centuries of borrowing words from other languages, especially French and Latin, and also by these academic corrections that added silent letters, sometimes based on, well, incorrect ideas about where words came from.
It really is an amazing story of linguistic inertia, isn't it? Things just kept going the way they were.
And Benjamin Franklin, he wasn't some lone eccentric voice crying in the wilderness. Many other really influential people wanted to fix English spelling. People like President Theodore Roosevelt, the famous author Mark Twain, even the scientist Charles Darwin, they all actively supported spelling reform movements at different times.
Which leads us to a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to mull over. If so many smart, influential people over the centuries agreed that English spelling was illogical, maybe even broken, and that it needed fixing, why do we still today spell 5 simple related words like through, rough, cough, thought, and bow in 5 totally different, utterly confusing ways?
It really does seem like the power of tradition, of just how things are done, is incredibly strong. Stronger, perhaps, than the logic of making things easier to learn. Now, before we wrap up completely, we want to quickly clarify some of the key English phrases we used during our discussion. This is especially for our listeners joining us from the Morozova School. We'll go through these nice and clearly.
Okay, first up, we kept using the phrase deep dive. Now this phrase, it just means to investigate something very thoroughly, really get into the details, like we tried to do with spelling history today. A deep dive.
Next, we talked about a language being phonetic. P-H-O-N-E-T-I-C. This means that the language is written exactly how it sounds. Every sound has a consistent symbol. Benjamin Franklin wanted to make English phonetic.
Third, we highlighted the problem of silent letters. Silent letters. These are letters that you find written in a word, but you don't actually pronounce them when you say the word, like the K in night, K-N-I-G-H-T, or that B in debt, D-E-B-T.
And finally, we discussed inconsistency. I-N-C-O-N-S-I-S-T-E-N-C-Y. This is just when something doesn't follow a clear rule or a predictable pattern. And as we've heard, English spelling is unfortunately full of inconsistency.
We really hope this discussion has given you a clearer, maybe a more detailed understanding of the fascinating history behind the language you're learning. It's messy, but it's interesting.
Absolutely. And we really encourage all our Morozova students to keep going with your learning journey, keep asking questions, and do connect with your community. You can find more resources and join the Morozova social networks. We'll make sure the link is available in the comments section or the show description. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.